Time to stop visiting now. So I've discovered two things. One is that my phone is 4 minutes faster than everybody else's in the world, which is really weird. And the other is that when you live stream something, it's a real pain to find out where it's actually going. But hopefully we've got those things figured out. My name's Betsy, and I'm the director of the Women's Center here on campus. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to the 25th Shannon Weatherly Memorial Lecture. And we have a very special guest speaker tonight, Professor Sarah Deer, who we have been trying to get to MSU for quite some time. So very excited this finally worked out. Tonight's lecture will be held in honor of the inconceivable number of victims of interpersonal violence, abuse, and murder throughout our tribal nations. Shannon Weatherly was a feminist, a peace advocate, an MSU alum, and a member of the MSU's founding board of advisors until her tragic death in 1982. For those of you that have programs, and I'm sorry we didn't have enough for everybody, please be sure to read about Shannon in your program tonight. Her mother, Frances Weatherly, generously started an endowment to sponsor this program. So as I said, this is the 25th Shannon Weatherly Memorial Lecture, and we're very excited to have Professor Sarah Deer here with us. We're thrilled to host this lecture and would like to say thank you to all of our supporters and the folks who co-sponsored this event with us tonight. The MSU Women's Center, the Society of American Indian Graduate Students, the MSU Voice Center, MSU's Counseling and Psychological Services, the Diversity and Inclusion Student Commons, the Women's Faculty Caucus, the President's Commission on the Status of University Women, and the Honors College. Thanks to all of you who support our work. We'd also like to note that Professor Deer's lecture focuses on a topic that is extremely sensitive, so we want you all to please take care of yourselves. We've also got some folks here from the Counseling and Psychological Services and the Voice Center who have very generously offered to serve as advocates for tonight's lecture. Will you guys stand up? They're all kind of clustered in the corner there. Yeah, these people do some serious hard work. In any case, if you are in need of some advocacy on your way out, if you need to leave tonight, please do so and go ahead and just let one of those folks know and they can go out with you. We also have copies of Professor Deer's book, and we will be selling those at the after this lecture, and there's a reception that follows, so please join us for that. We'll be back there at that table, and those books are $20 a piece, and that's quite a bargain. It's a wonderful book, and I don't know if I know some of you here have read it, but it's The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America. It's an amazing book. In addition to Professor Sarah Deer, tonight we have two very special guests joining us for this program. The first is Terry Bradley, who will graduate in December with a degree in elementary education with a science option. Terry has been a sustained dialogue moderator, an LGBTQ mentor, marketing director for the American Indian Council of MSU, and student advisor for the Society of Indigenous Educators. He worked at the Diversity and Inclusion Student Commons throughout most of his college career and held the inaugural position of the ASMSU Student Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Last spring, Terry wrote and performed a piece called You See at the Bozeman Monologues. For those of you who missed his performance last year, you're very lucky to see it here tonight. We miss seeing Terry's face in the sub as he's doing his student teaching this semester, but please welcome Mr. Terry Bradley.
Alrighty. I haven't looked at this since I performed it in March, so. You see, my existence is a disruption, a living memory, a constant reminder of a history that was so harshly, intentionally, purposefully, deliberately, savagely. forgotten in this world we've written, where not only the printed lies are white, but so is the paper. You see, while the history of my people is offered as an alternative course tailored to white curiosity, white history is the standard, the default. You see, white privilege isn't a channel you tune into. It's the white noise when nothing is broadcasting. Yet, when I speak up, I'm the angry Indian, or the indigenous expert, the token native to be exchanged for treaty checks, fee waivers, diversity quotas. You see, I find it ironic that the only coin now deemed worthless has copper skin. Because at this campus, according to this college, you'd think I could paint with the colors of the wind. You see, 92%, lowest it has ever been, of students identify as white. As a native, I am a collector's item, a rare find. I am deemed brave, strong, unique. You see, they never see me. I'm always something more or less. My accomplishments are always in spite of the color of my skin, yet my failures are always dependent on it. Constantly, I think about what I say, what I do, how I say it, how I do it. Will they listen? Will they see? Will they ignore it? Because I'm native? You see, I'm still trying to learn how not to get caught. So I talk using the mother tongue of those who oppress me. So I dress with the clothes of those who despise me. So I act like those around me as not to draw any attention to my differences. I do this not for me, but for we. We who never saw high school graduation. We who are more familiar with iron bars than textbooks. We who know what it means to go without food and heat. We who are so removed from our traditional ways, and so we adapt, assimilate, attempt to blend into the concrete walls so the spotlight never finds us. Never to be glorified as an individual, nor shamed as a racial representative. I am here simply to survive. In a society designed to eliminate me, and in that I am thriving. You see, the new war cry isn't protests and policy changes, it's laughter. The echo of trauma, strength, and healing. A song of resilience. You see, to survive in this world means that they have not won, that we are still here. I'll say it again, we are still here. It is never a factor of if we succeed, but when. 3 times more likely to drop out, to commit suicide, to try harder, to work more, to show up. You see, the value of that degree is much more than a better future for myself, but a better world for us all, a better chance to survive. You see? Alrighty, and then our next speaker is Meg Singer, who is Navajo from Salt Lake City. She currently works for the ACLU of Montana as the Indigenous Justice Program Manager. I have had the honor to work with Meg to increase the knowledge of Indigenous rights and justice all across the state, and it comes with the highest regard to seek her out as a resource, ally, advocate, and most importantly, a friend.
Well, that was awesome, Terry. Thanks for that. You're making me cry. Yate abine. Yate. There you go. Okay, thank you. I am lucky and super happy to be able to introduce our lecturer for this evening. I was going to have this honor 7 months ago when Professor Deer was going to come to MSU, and we were all excited. And then something happened, and she had a family emergency. Well, finally found out what that family emergency was. She was being super cool and was on a motorcycle with her husband, and they had an accident, and he broke both of his elbows. But it was because she fell on him that they broke. She said that. That's funny. So I met Professor Deer's work in early 2016, and I got this book, and I found it through native social media. Someone had posted it, and I was like, I need to read that book. Got it, could not put it down, just made everything seem clear. As a person who is always constantly being framed as, you know, this is the problems in our society, Professor Deer blows everything away and just is the blueprint of what we need to fight our own oppression. And it's the blueprint that our allies need to be right there alongside with us. So a little bit, oh, someone's calling me from Fort Peck. Get out of here. So did you know that Professor Deer has been doing this for 25 years? I'm 32. So that means I was 7 when she started doing this. And I've only been doing this work with the ACLU for 2 years. And I had the opportunity to ask her, how are you doing this and still smiling? How? And in her book, it has to be done. Who else is going to do it? In 1995, she graduated in women's studies with honors at the University of Kansas. Clap. In 1999, she got her law degree from the University of Kansas. Clap. She's from the Muskogee Creek Nation and has worked to end violence against Native women. She has been a MacArthur Fellow in 2014, which is a huge deal. It's big. And she has been influential in passing policy, both federal, tribal. She's just a formidable woman. I would like to talk to the Indigenous people in the room right now. I'd like you to please stand. Stand, seriously. I want you to know that this book and Professor Deer and her work is for you, to continue your work, to continue your education. It's going to be a weapon that you're going to use to continue her work. You are not the leaders of tomorrow. We need you now. There are people who are missing. Ashley Loring, Heavy Runner, is still missing. ICWA in Texas, it's going on. We have dropout rates, we have recidivism for probation and parole. Look to Professor Deer and look to her words to help you get strength to continue forward. This is for you. It was written for you. It has helped me so much in the work that I'm doing, and it will help you in the work that you're doing. And lastly, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for working so hard to make Indigenous Peoples Day happen. Without you, we would be lost. Look at how these people are dealing with how the tragedies that are happening in our country. They will look to us to know how to make it through. It's because of our ways of knowing and our ways of thinking that are going to make that happen. Go ahead and sit down. Thank you. So without further ado, I was just so happy to meet Sarah Deer, and I was just so happy that we were able to chat and laugh. I was really nervous that she didn't have a sense of humor. She does! I'm just so grateful to welcome her here to Montana State University. So please welcome with me, Professor Sarah Deer.
Wow, thank you. This is a really big crowd. This is amazing. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'll just make one correction to the motorcycle story. I'm not cool enough to have a motorcycle. It was a regular bicycle. It has a motor on it that helps you pedal, and it has a seat on the back. It wasn't a bicycle built for two. My husband bought this thing, and it's got a seat on the back, but I'm not pedaling. But when he fell over, I did fall on top of him and smash both his elbows. He's fine. He didn't need surgery or anything. He just couldn't lift anything for 6 months. So I had to buy the milk and do all that good stuff. But I'm so disappointed that I was not able to be here in March. I think it was the day before I was supposed to leave that we had the accident, and I couldn't figure out, the doctors wouldn't tell us really how bad it was because they needed the swelling to go down, and so I was like, ugh. If he's really, really hurt, I need to be here for him. So thank you for allowing me to cancel. I guess you didn't have much of a choice, but thank you for being so gracious as to invite me back here for Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm really, really excited and honored to be part of this day. I just, you kind of go through your Facebook feed and there's really bad news and really good news going on all the time. But today what made me so happy is so many people are not talking about Columbus Day, they're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day. So here we are. I talk about a very serious topic, and sometimes when we deal with these really serious topics, there's a couple of different ways that we can sort of cope with the difficult material. One of the things I do is I may seem like I'm making light of things, not of sexual assault itself, but kind of me and being dorky. And then the other thing that happens is I try to really be cerebral about my work. And I think that's a way of coping with it as a survivor of sexual violence and an advocate for survivors for so many years. It is important that we find those healthy coping mechanisms. And if yours is let me think it out, that's okay. That's a healthy coping mechanism. So that's what you'll probably see some of me doing tonight. I do have a little bit of a journey that I want to take you on. And there's some really frustrating parts of that journey and some really inspirational parts of that journey. I'm not going to be talking about anything explicit. In other words, I'm not going to be describing any sexual assaults per se, and I'm not going to be giving any visual depictions of sexual violence, but that doesn't matter. It can still be very triggering for people. So I'm really glad that folks are here who can talk to you about your feelings. And maybe it's not even something that happened to you. Maybe it's something that happened to someone that you loved and it's affecting you. And that's okay. But I promise you that I will end on a very positive note. So stick with me as I go through some difficult material. Most people have heard the statistics, right, about the high rates of violence against Native women, and I want to kind of tell you where those come from. So the federal government does victimization surveys, and what they do is they call or contact a random sample of Americans and ask them a series of questions about what kinds of crimes they may have experienced, when they experienced them, who committed the crimes, and the like. Because we know that most victims never report their crime to police. So if you were just to go to count police reports, right, you're missing 90% of the crime that's happening. So the most recent federal report we have that focuses on Native women and men comes from, it's just a little over 2 years old now. It's available on the government website from May of 2016. And I'm going to show you some of the data from here, and I do that with some trepidation because we are not numbers. We are living, breathing human beings, but numbers get attention, and that's what I found in doing federal work and doing legislative reform is that these numbers have made a difference. We already knew this information before the federal government did, but now we have to use it because it's what gets the attention of lawmakers. And I don't mean this also to suggest that I'm playing any kind of oppression Olympics. It doesn't matter what color your skin is or what your ethnicity is. If you've been sexually assaulted, that is a high experience of trauma. But here's kind of what we're looking at. So this comes from that 2016 report authored by Dr. Rose. What I want to show you here is that when we look at any lifetime violence, American Indian and Alaska Native women, over 84% of American Indian and Alaska Native have experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. That's pretty much all of us, right? And then if we go down to the second line there, sexual violence, 56.1%. That's more than 1 in 2. So if you know Native people in your life, over half of them have been experiencing sexual violence of some sort. So it's a crisis situation, but it's not a recently developing crisis. People said, why do we have these high rates? I'll get to that in just a moment. But suffice it to say that we have a crisis situation because it's going to be very difficult for our communities and our nations to thrive and survive if this many people are experiencing violent crime. Who is committing these crimes? Well, that's kind of a controversial question, but consistently throughout the federal data that we have from the government, it is clear that Native people, when they are asked about their perpetrators, report that most of the time their perpetrators are members of a different race. And that's characterized here or symbolized by the top 2 bars here. The blue bar represents Native women, and the red bar represents Native men. So when women are asked, what race was your perpetrator, 97% of the time she says someone who is non-Native. And that's 90% for Native men. Now, that's not to say that Native people don't commit these crimes. They do, and we have to hold ourselves accountable. But you can see on the second set of bars that it's a much lower rate. So when Native women are asked if you had a Native perpetrator, 35% say yes, 33% for men. And you can see then between if you add up 97% and 35%, you get more than 100%. And I think that's a reflection that most of us have been victims multiple times in our lives. And some of our perpetrators are Native and some of them are not. Now, when I talk about the importance of this interracial rate, a couple things you need to know. One is that that this will help you understand the jurisdictional framework that I'm going to talk about later. But it's also really unusual to have this kind of interracial data in criminology in the United States. Most of the time in this country, if you are a white victim, your perpetrator is more likely than not to be white. And that's true for every race in the United States with the exception of Native people. So there's something going on here that we have to understand as to why we are victims of interracial crime at such high rates. Now, one of the things that the federal studies don't ask, but is an incredibly important question, is what are the experiences of our LGBTQ Two-Spirit community? We do not yet have a national study on this question. We have some regional data that suggests the crisis is as high or higher for our Two-Spirit population. So in one state survey, nearly 1 in 3 LGBT natives reported experiencing hate violence. Research with Native lesbian, bisexual, and Two-Spirit women revealed a high prevalence, sexual abuse at 85% and physical abuse at 78%. I'm hoping that with new scholars coming out into the world, we will finally have some national data on this question because our Two-Spirit relatives deserve it. How did we get here? That's the question mostly that I get from non-natives. Like, why is it so high? Why do Native people experience such a high rate of crime? And the answer to that is like 25 years of like trying to figure it out myself. So I start, we have to start kind of thinking about, where did this come from? Where did this high rate enter into our existence? Because I don't believe we can solve the problem unless we can identify the origin of the problem. And so I start by talking about sovereignty. And sovereignty is a buzzword, an important word, but it can be kind of overused at times, and we kind of underuse it at other places. So when I talk about sovereignty, what I mean to say is that as tribal nations, we had full authority to respond to crime that happened within our community. We also know that, and again, I'm sort of lumping all tribes together here, which is a dangerous thing to do, but I only have, 45 minutes. So I want to be clear that every tribal nation is unique and has its own history. But one of the common themes that comes from our knowledge and our history is that our systems tended to be more victim-centered than the systems that came over on the boats. And there were a variety of ways that victims were centered in the response. I'll tell you about my tribes in just a second. And we had pretty serious laws that protected us. We didn't have necessarily black robes and gavels and attorneys with long books on the wall, but we did have legal systems that were compassionate and restorative in nature. And we did not tolerate violence against women in our communities, especially women and children. Some of our tribal nations were matrilocal or matrilineal, meaning that the woman was sort of the center of the family. But even in our patrilineal tribes, there was an understanding of balance and respect for women. And we did have pretty serious punishments for violence like sexual violence and domestic violence, including things like banishment and death. Now, I don't raise that to suggest that I want to endorse the death penalty in 2018. What I'm suggesting is that we took these crimes very, very seriously, and so seriously that you could sacrifice your life for violating a child. So one of the things I tried to do when I was a student is, when I was a law student, is I wanted to understand what my nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, how our people traditionally had responded to crimes like domestic violence and sexual assault. And I had the opportunity to select my own paper topic when I was a second-year law student. And I said, okay, well, I want to write my paper on my tribe and my ancestors and how they responded to violent crime. But I found myself unable to find anything written about that concept. And I was in Lawrence at the time, and I didn't have the sort of the funding to like go down to my tribe for the summer and talk to people about this question, so I was sort of stuck in the libraries. And I couldn't find anything. I went to my Indian law professor. I know some of you are students, have had this experience where you go to your professor, you're like, I have to change my topic. And I was really bummed out about it. And he said, well, I wouldn't change it just yet. He said, I would encourage you to go look a little bit about what maybe non-Indians had written down, observations of your people. And he said, obviously, you have to be really careful with that because it can be very racist and Eurocentric and, very demeaning and those kinds of things. But he said, sometimes you find these sympathetic observers. So I went back to the stacks, as it were, and I came across the volume of letters and journals written by William Bartram, who is a white American who lived in the southeastern part of the United States before we got removed, and lived among us for about 10 years, about a decade between the Creek and Cherokee territories. He was writing down plants and animals and doing drawings. He was a naturalist. And so one of the things that he noted about our culture that he thought was so interesting, and he remarked on it several times, was the lack of, domestic violence that he saw in his observations of our people. He never saw, he says, or heard in that 10 years of an instant of an Indian beating his wife. And so that was a really powerful moment for me when I read that, and I used that as a springboard to continue working on the paper that I had my heart set on. And that led me to this next slide, which is the first written rape law that my tribe passed prior to removal in 1824. We were a very heavily assimilated tribe pretty early on, partly just as a survival mechanism, but we also were heavily intermarried with Scottish immigrants. And we were very anxious to make sure that we could stay on our land and keep our land. And so we were doing a lot of things to make the federal agents happy with us. And so one of the things they said is, if you're a civilized tribe and that's what you want to be, then you have to write down your laws so that everybody knows what they are. Just completely missing the fact that our laws were oral did mean that everybody knew what the laws were. So we agreed, and this rape law was written down in English in 1824. It was written down by a man named Chili McIntosh. I always am so envious when I come to the plains and I know of these revered names, right? Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and these amazing, like, just statuesque names. And then I have Chili McIntosh as my ancestor, but, you know, whatever works. He had a Scottish father and a Creek mother, so it's Chili McIntosh. But anyway, you can tell already, you've been looking at this slide now, you know why I picked this, right? I think it's fascinating that the very first time we wrote down the penalties for rape, we put the victim at the center, right? What she say, it be law, right? That's a really powerful thing to think about, because I can guarantee you that if you went and looked through state laws from 1824, you're not going to see any mention of the woman being at the center of the resolution of that crime. Because, of course, for Anglo-American society, rape was a property crime. It was a property crime against a father or a husband, right? It wasn't a crime against a woman, because women were property at that time in the Anglo-American law. So this got me very excited again to think, wow, you know, we had a system, even though we were so assimilated and we were using English and we were writing down our laws and doing all of these things that seemed to be assimilated, we somehow kept a hold of something here that was not part of the Anglo-American mindset. What's sad is that after removal, and the next time we wrote down our laws in English, that red passage is nowhere to be seen. So as we became further assimilated, we lost some of that historical respect that we had in the aftermath of sexual violence. So the question then is, how do we talk about this disparate data, right? How do we say, well, we had nations and communities that had low rates of violence, and now we have the highest rate in the nation, right? How do we tell that story? What explains that story? And again, it's to that question, it's why I titled my book The Beginning and End of Rape, because I don't think we can end rape in this nation until we understand the origin of it. And that's why I want to talk to you about this history. So I'm a lawyer. I'm maybe a recovering lawyer. I don't know. I don't practice anymore. But there are many, many, many factors that I want to acknowledge that play into this question. But the factor I'm going to look at is the legal factor, the laws that have come to create such a crisis for our people. So coming back to this term sovereignty, the sovereignty is really not a very complicated concept. We know what sovereignty is. We just take it for granted in most contexts, right? So I come from Kansas. So the state of Kansas has sovereignty. All that means is that Kansas is a government that can make laws and be governed by them, right? And so we don't even talk about it. We don't talk about the sovereignty of the state of Montana, right? It's a given, right? And the same thing with the federal government. We don't worry about the sovereignty of the federal government. It's sort of a given, right? But when it comes to tribal nations, it's fraught. It's always complicated. It's always confusing. It's always challenging to figure out how to talk about it. And so when I talk about sovereignty, that's simply all I mean, is the ability of a government to do government work. And that shouldn't be hard to understand, but it is when a context of tribal nations. So when I think about sovereignty, I think about, the fact that we had these effective legal systems that worked well, that kept crime rates low, but those systems have been weakened by colonial power and control. The reason I named my talk this evening, The Sovereignty of the Soul, is because I think as rape survivors and people who've been through very violent experiences know that when you are attacked, it is though the fabric of your identity has been attacked. So I see sexual violence as a a form of denying the sovereignty of the soul, the ability to make decisions about what happens to your body, who gets to decide what happens to your body. And when that is taken away from you, you've lost that sense of personal sovereignty. And so I think there's a strong parallel between what tribal nations have experienced over the years and what survivors of sexual assault, no matter what your race or your background, have also experienced. So I set out to understand the story of sovereignty and the story of tribal nations as a way of sort of understanding my own sense of surviving and of understanding what we need to do to end it. Because if we can figure out where it started, I think, and I truly believe this, or I wouldn't be doing this work, I believe we can end rape as a political crime in this nation. So most people have heard of the Trail of Tears. Many of you probably studied the Trail of Tears, but it's the story of forced removal and migration, or as Kevin Gover, when he was the director of the BIA, said in 2000, ethnic cleansing. The Trail of Tears was not just one trail, and it was much more than tears. There were a variety of different forced removals all over the continent. This just happens to be my ancestor's story. The thing that we don't often talk about with the Trail of Tears, we talk about the land loss, we talk about the death, we talk about the forced removal. We talk, and in fact, in my tribe, we still call the Mississippi River the river of death, because so many people, our people died trying to cross it. But what we don't often talk about is the very high rate of sexual violence that goes along with forced removal. And we know this from international, right? We know that when women are refugees of war, right, the sexual violence rate is just what's the word I'm looking for? Thank you. Yeah, astronomical. Got excited there for a second. And so it was no different here, right? And so if you really go dig deep into the archives, if you look at what the missionaries were saying, if you look at what the journals were saying, women and children were being taken from the march, sexually assaulted, and returned to the march the next morning. And that happened on a systemic scale, and there was never a single prosecution for any of those crimes. So we get to Indian Territory, which of course we were promised forever, and we have suffered trauma beyond belief. We've lost people, we've lost our homelands, we've lost the places where we pray, and we have been experiencing sexual violence at a very high rate with no accountability for the offenders. And you know, forced removal happened all over the continent. It happened in the Southwest too. This is a picture of some Dene or Navajo women after the long walk. And there's not much known about this picture. We don't know who these women are, these children are. But as a rape victim and as an advocate, I feel confident in saying that these women were experiencing trauma. The looks on their faces, the look in their eyes, their facial expressions, it's more than just being serious for a long exposure black and white camera. To me, it is palpable, because I think that this rape went along with forced migration no matter where it happened. These were some women, Dakota women in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where I lived until a couple of years ago, at Fort Snelling after the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. They were separated from their men, they were separated from their fathers and their husbands and brothers and uncles, and were kept as prisoners in a concentration camp outside Fort Snelling in St. Paul, Minnesota, and they were also victims of mass rape. But it wasn't all, this wasn't, I want to be clear that these were not passive victims, right? The idea that we didn't speak out, we didn't fight back. The example I have from this time period is this Sarah Winnemucca, who's sort of one of my historical heroes. She was the first Native woman to write a book in the United States, and it was published in 1883, and it's called Life Among the Paiutes. What's so amazing to me about this book is it's about the plight of her people generally. And all of the harms that had come to them. And she was trying to educate particularly wealthy white folks on the East Coast so that she could help fund her school that she wanted to start for Paiute children. But what was so brave about what she did is she talked specifically and explicitly about sexual violence in her book in several different passages. And the reason I think that's so amazing is because if you think about 1883, it really wasn't safe for white women to talk about sexual violence, much less a woman of color. And here we have a documented account of a woman that was not afraid to speak truth to power and documented for everyone and for posterity the harm that was coming to her people. So I think of her as the first Me Too Native American activist. You can't talk about sexual violence in our nation's history without talking about Native boarding schools. It's a difficult thing for me to talk about. This is the part of the presentation where I tend to choke up a little bit. I'm not sure why, since all of it is distressing. But when we understand what boarding schools did, what they were intended to do was bad enough, but some of the other things that came along with boarding schools were just as bad, or were even worse than what was intended. So this is one of the before and after picture shots of the same group of children before and after they went to boarding school. And it's just such a powerful thing to see. I'll go back again. It's the same group of children. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, I want you to notice who took this picture. It says the U.S. Army. So these were Apache children that were rounded up and sent all the way to Pennsylvania, to Carlisle, where their hair was cut, they were given uniforms, they were denied the right to speak their language and pray in the way that they had been taught. And from what we now know, there were high rates of sexual abuse going on in these institutions. I think that the boarding school era represents one of the largest systemic, institutionalized forms of child abuse in our nation's history. And when we understand today there's survivors who, because the boarding school era really didn't end until about 40 years ago, that there are survivors coming forward today to talk about the very, very, very high rate of brutal sexual abuse that children were suffering in many of these schools. So there were these different federal laws and policies over time that sort of introduce sexual violence on a mass scale, on a political scale, used as a technique to destroy and dehumanize Native women and children and Two-Spirit people. And I think that we have to look beyond what we typically see in the history books and find those stories about surviving sexual violence, because they're there if we look hard enough. The next thing I want to talk to you about is some specific laws that have gotten in the way of tribal nations protecting their own people. And so I want to talk about, well, there's 4, but I really want to talk about 3 in particular that have to do with why tribal nations today struggle to provide appropriate responses to people who have been victims of violence. It's all about unilateral imposition of federal law without the consent of tribal nations. And it's important to understand this so you understand why tribal nations need to have their power restored so that we can begin protecting our own people again. The first law that I want to talk about is the Major Crimes Act. It's a federal law. It was passed in the 1880s, and it came about as part of a case that got a lot of attention at the time. Many of you may be familiar with this Supreme Court case, but it's called Ex parte Crow Dog. The case itself did not have anything to do with sexual violence, but the impact does, and so that's why I want to talk about it. It's still good law today. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you see a Brule Lakota chief named Crow Dog, and he was the one the case was about. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a rival chief named Spotted Tail. And Crow Dog and Spotted Tail, this was in the Dakota Territories in the late 19th century. They didn't get along very well. They had very different perspectives and philosophies about what to do with the army and what to do with the encroaching, sort of settlement that was coming. And Crow Dog shot and killed Spotted Tail. It might have been with the gun he's holding here in the picture. I'm not sure. But he did commit a homicide, and he was adjudicated and sanctioned for that homicide by his people, by the Lakota people in the Dakota Territories. So as far as the tribe was concerned, they had resolved the matter. And again, it's not clear exactly what the penalties were that were imposed upon Crow Dog, but one sort of framing of it is that he was sort of on lifetime restitution to the family of his victim, so that they would not suffer his loss suffer from a long-term from his loss, but rather he would be expected to provide for that family. But the federal government was pretty unhappy about that result, and they thought that the right answer to this crime should have been that Crow Dog would be hanged for committing this murder. So they decided to try to prosecute him in federal court so they could hang, because he was considered to be a problem Indian, right? He was pushing buttons a little bit more than Spotted Tail was, and so the federal agents were really not comfortable with him walking as they saw it. So they prosecuted him and they convicted him and they sentenced him to hang. And he had some good attorneys, and he went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and said, where does the federal government get power here? We have a treaty reservation. All of this happened on the reservation. The resolution of the crime and the adjudication of the crime happened on the reservation. Where does the federal government get the power to prosecute me? And he won. The Supreme Court sided with him and said, you're right. I mean, it wasn't a very Indian-friendly decision in the sense that, I mean, they used the S word, they said savage, and it was not like, you know, Indians are good people, let's, you know, support them. It was like, well, he's got a point, right? I mean, there's this bounded reservation, and there's no other government that should be, you know, getting involved in these crimes. The federal agents were so angry about that result, so Crow Dog walked. And the government was so angry about the result of that, they went to Congress and had Congress pass a law that's now called the Major Crimes Act that gives the federal government authority on Indian reservations. That's where it came from, right? So even though today there are U.S. attorneys and FBI agents that are trying to do the right thing, right? By having this power, by investigating crimes and prosecuting crimes, you have to understand the origin of that law was not to protect Native rape victims. The origin of that law was to control problem Indians. And that's still good law today. So that's why on most reservations in the lower 48, if there is a crime, like a heavy domestic, like violent domestic violence crime or a sexual violence crime, the U.S. government has authority there. And the history of that has not been great. In fact, as recently as 2015, the GAO reported that U.S. attorneys decline upwards of 60% of the rape cases that even come to their attention, right? So it's broken. It's not working like it should. So that's the first law I wanted to talk about, is the Major Crimes Act. The second one is the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. This often, you know, when you hear it and you hear 1968 and you hear civil rights, you think of really progressive legislation that sort of changed the fabric of our nation in terms of discrimination, right? But this Civil Rights Act wasn't quite the same thing. This Civil Rights Act imposed American-style civil liberties upon tribal nations. So it was another sort of unilateral, here's, we're the federal government, we're telling you how to run your system here. And so it wasn't really about civil rights, in my opinion. So it did a lot of different things, but the thing that I think is most important for you to know tonight is that it limited the ability of tribal nations to sentence offenders. Initially, it was just 6 months for maximum penalty for any crime that might be heard in tribal court. So that would include homicide and sexual violence, right? 6 months max. It was changed to 1 year in the 1980s as part of the war on drugs. We got up to a year incarceration. But beyond that, tribal courts cannot in terms of incarceration, tribal courts cannot sentence to more than 1 year for any crime. And so you can understand then why a survivor, somebody who's experienced trauma in a small closed community, knowing that the maximum penalty that can be imposed is 1 year by the tribe, that might make you reluctant to come forward because he'll probably come back in a year, right? And it doesn't feel safe for a lot of us. So I see this as a significant barrier for tribal nations trying to protect their own people. Finally, I want to say just a couple things about Oliphant versus Suquamish. I didn't know until I read this case that you could actually personally have a nemesis that was a Supreme Court case. This is my nemesis, and this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to deal with. But Oliphant versus Suquamish was not decided that long ago. It was 1978. It's not 1878, it's 1978. And this decision, even though it just dealt with one tribe, the Suquamish tribe, the result of it, Indian law case in the Supreme Court, means that it applies to all 570 plus federally recognized tribes. So it eliminated tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. That means that whatever a non-Indian does, whether it's rape, homicide, child sex abuse, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, vandalism, if it's a non-Indian, the tribal court has no criminal authority over that person. Now remember the statistics I showed you at the very beginning? Most of the time when Native people report that they've been victims of crime, they report that their perpetrator was a non-Indian. I think this has something to do with that. I don't think it's the only explanation, but certainly it doesn't help, right? Now, I can't prove that Oliphant caused non-Indians to be violent towards us because we don't have the data from before Oliphant to be able to show, compare, and contrast. But many of the reservations where I've traveled to across the years have told me that one of the big problems, and it's not every reservation, some reservations are really remote and isolated, others are more, in a more urban or town area, that there is a problem with non-Indians knowing they're above the law and knowing that they can get away with things that they couldn't get away with elsewhere. So I've set out, ever since I read this case in law school, I was like, we got to fix this. And my professor's like, oh yeah, okay, you try. And we're doing it, so I'm just saying. So by the end of the 20th century, we are really struggling to protect our own people. We can only prosecute Indians. We have this limit on incarceration. And then, of course, the biggest challenge in Indian country is resources. Criminal justice systems are incredibly expensive to operate, and many tribal nations simply don't have the resources to establish one. There's also sort of the quandary of, do we want to spend money building a jail and locking up our own people? I mean, there's a lot of questions that come with sort of contemporary criminal justice in Indian country. But I see these barriers as being one of the main reasons that our rates are so high. The system is broken. The system doesn't work. When people come forward, nothing happens, right? The system is too weak to deal with the drama and the trauma that we're dealing with on such a vast scale. So now what do we do? Well, the first thing we have to do is think about some of the other contemporary crimes that are happening, right? Sex trafficking, missing and murdered Indigenous women has become a very hot topic now, and I can't tell you how happy I am to know that, because it's been going on for a really long time. If we look at things like California laws, even after the Civil War, slavery was essentially still legal for Native people in California. Children, girls were taken by settlers, by fur traders, by hunters who would actually kidnap Native girls to be their concubine and their sex slave, essentially. And you can find this information, and if you look in the history books, it's there. One Indian agent in 1885 here in Montana talked about the fact that the soldiers were essentially extorting sex from Native women on reservations for food, for clothing, for blankets, for things for their children, and that they were being forced to barter their bodies for these goods that the military had control over. Even when Native women got rich, we were still targeted. So this there were very few times in our history where oil might be discovered on an Indian reservation, like in Oklahoma. And then suddenly white men are really attracted to Native women and want to marry them and have babies with them, and then they die. And in Osage country, at the turn of the century, people were marrying Native women for their money, and then they were dying. And it was one of the very first serial killer cases ever investigated by the FBI as they tried to get to the bottom of it. Contemporary sex trafficking in Native women. Again, when I was living in the Twin Cities, over 24% of women on probation for prostitution were Native women, even though we only made up about 2 or 3% of the Twin Cities population. We know that, that sex trafficking has been affiliated with energy extraction, oil workers, man camps, that there have been rings of sex trafficking that have been based out of land exploitation. So there's a lot of contemporary kind of permutations of this story. But now I want to tell you the really good news, and that is that we are fixing this. We are on our way to making a long-standing, a long-lasting difference in the lives of our Native women and children. So I want to talk to you about the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013, and then the latest fight in the US Supreme Court. And these are all things that you all can get involved in, right? It's not just the lawyers and the people in Washington, D.C. Grassroots work is critical here because we have to convince Congress to do a lot of things. And that's why it's important everybody gets involved. So I want to start first with the Tribal Law and Order Act of July 2010. This was the result of about 3 years of hard work on the Hill. I got to go to the signing. Don't look at me I was not on stage. I was not that important. I was way in the back, like behind the cameras and stuff. But I was there. I didn't get a pen, you know, I mean, it was one of those things. But it was amazing. So the Tribal Law and Order Act is a big piece of legislation that does a lot of different things. It puts a lot more like onus on the federal government to like be transparent about what they're doing. But the part that I want to talk about is the sentencing change, because now you can sentence someone in tribal court to up to 3 years. So we went from 1 year to 3 years, which doesn't seem like much, and maybe it's not, but it was a fight. And it's just the start of the fight, right? I don't know why a sovereign nation would have any other government telling them what the maximum sentence is that they can impose, but here we are, right? The other thing they did here is say that you could stack the offenses. So if you get someone on like 3 different crimes, you could sentence them to 9 years, 3 for each crime. So it's a step in the right direction. And again, there's many other components of what we call TLOA, the Tribal Law and Order Act, that have had a positive impact in Indian country. The Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized in March of 2013. And it's not just about Indian women. I mean, Violence Against Women Act is a really broad-based legislation, but what was so cool is that there wasn't room in the White House for all of the people that wanted to be at the signing, so they moved it to Interior. So it was like in the like belly of the Indian like community at the, you know, the Interior Department, where a lot of Native people work, of course. What was so great about this law, again, it did a lot of different things, a lot of moving pieces, is that it lifted that Oliphant restriction. So remember I said that tribes were not allowed to prosecute non-Indians? We now can, but only for domestic violence, and only if we meet certain like other requirements. There's about 20 tribes right now that are actively prosecuting non-Indians for domestic violence, and it's because of this law. And I can tell you right now that we're going back to Congress and we're asking for that expansion of restoration so that we can prosecute other crimes like sexual violence and sex trafficking and drug trafficking. I think we should just, you know, in my like ideal world, we would just undo Oliphant all at once and just flip it. I'm learning that I have to be more patient than that. But here's the deal. I told you when I read Oliphant when I was a law student, I said, this is horrible. And my law professor, who was a great man, by the way, was a little like, oh, it's never going to happen. And then I went to D.C. right after law school, and I heard that again, it's never going to happen. And then we did it. So just saying, again. So there are bills right now in Congress. You can find them largely connected with the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization that would expand tribal jurisdiction to include other crimes that are harming our communities. I don't think it should matter who you are. If you come into our community, you live in our community, you work in our community, and you hurt people in our community, you should be held accountable in our tribal courts. It's not that hard, right? I mean, if I committed a crime tonight here in Bozeman, by the way, I wouldn't. I love it here. Thank you for having me. But let's say I did. Let's say I robbed a liquor store tonight in Bozeman. Seriously. And I go in front of the judge tomorrow and I say, well, I'm from Kansas, so you can't prosecute me. I mean, I would not get very far with that argument. I'm not going to try it, but I can pretty much guarantee you I wouldn't get very far in their argument. But somehow, when it's a tribal nation and somebody says, well, you know, I'm not from here. I don't vote here. Well, you're here, and you're hurting people, right? So we just have to keep working on it. But I can tell you that there were a lot of men who told me that this would never happen, and it did. Okay. I heard, yes, queen. All right, I have just a few more things to say, but then I really want to get a chance to talk to you guys and take any questions, or I don't know what we're going to do. But we're also going to the Supreme Court because every year the Supreme Court takes Indian law cases. And we're losing them. We're losing them like 70% of the time. We're actually doing better in Congress than we are in the courts. And so we have to be present there too. So I want to talk to you about just a couple of cases that I've worked on, and I'm sure some of you also worked on them too. But again, I want you to see here in this picture, this was the day that the Dollar General case was argued in front of the Supreme Court, and we had a heavy, heavy presence of Native activists that stayed outside during the oral arguments and prayed and chanted and sang. I got to go in and see the arguments, but when I came out, I can't tell you how wonderful it was to walk out and see this beautiful display of Native faces, because we're just not going down without a fight. It's not going to happen. So Dollar General was this really scary case because there was so much at stake. Dollar General is, I don't know if it's the same in Montana, but most of the time when I travel to Indian country, there's a Dollar General store on the reservation. Not so much here. Well, it's kind of like Walmart. It's like everywhere so there's this Dollar General store on the Mississippi Choctaw Reservation. And the Dollar General store had a lease with the tribe and a business license from the tribe, and they sold they had their Dollar General store there. And then one summer they got involved with the tribe in a youth opportunity program, which was basically an opportunity for young teens on the reservation to be placed in a business or other kind of entity to kind of keep them off the streets for the summer, but also teach them a little something about what it's like to work retail. Unfortunately, the white manager of this Dollar General store molested a Choctaw boy. And he reported it to his parents, and of course the tribe couldn't do anything because he was white. He was fired, and he was basically banished from the reservation, but there was nothing that the tribe could do criminally. And the federal government didn't get involved because there was no penetration in the crime. And so the family was left feeling, without any justice done here. So what they decided to do was file a lawsuit, a civil, private, personal injury lawsuit against the Dollar General Corporation for harm that was done to their child, medical bills, counseling bills, right, those kinds of things. And they filed it in tribal court. Well, Dollar General said, no, we're not Indian. We don't belong there. We don't come to tribal court because we're not tribal. Does this sound familiar, right? It sounds like the Oliphant argument. They were essentially making that argument, but for civil cases. And they were serious about it. They put millions and millions of dollars into lawyers to fight just showing up in court, just showing up. Right? And they may have had a great case, because one of the things you have to know is to hold a corporation accountable for something like that, you have to show that they knew they had a child molester working for them and they didn't do anything about it. And maybe they would have won that case, but they weren't even willing to show up in tribal court. So they appealed it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They lost every step of the way, by the way. They lost at the federal district court and the federal circuit court, and then the Supreme Court decided to hear the case, and my heart sank, because we're not winning there. And this would have been Oliphant, but for civil. We would have lost all jurisdiction over non-Indians. It was a very scary time. So we wanted to make sure that the Supreme Court heard from the voices of victims, because by the time it gets up to the court, it's sort of a sanitized mechanical question. It's the tribe on the one hand, and then the corporation on the other hand, and the victim is gone. Right? And so we wanted to make sure that if the court was going to decide this case, they needed to consider the perspective of victims of crime, who would lose more than anyone, really, if this case was decided the wrong way. So as I said, the victim was the young boy, the perpetrator was a white manager, there was no criminal prosecution, and all we were talking about was a civil tort suit. So we decided, a few Native attorneys and I decided that we would file a brief, a friend of the court brief, on behalf of Native women's organizations around the country. And what was so great is it wasn't just Native women's organizations that signed on. We had non-Native domestic violence programs and non-Native sexual assault programs who also supported us in this brief. It was just really important for us to make sure that the justices understood what was at stake here. And our brief looked a little differently than a lot of briefs that are filed in cases like this. We did something a little unusual, and that is that we put quotes from Native women throughout the brief. Not legal, like, citations, but actually living, breathing voices of Native women talking about these issues. And we sprinkled that throughout the brief. And a lot of the, sort of old guard attorneys are like, that's weird. But they didn't really understand what it was we were trying to do, which is to raise the profile and the voices of Native women and children. The case was heard in 2015 with 9 justices on the court. A justice passed away before the case was decided, and that was Justice Antonin Scalia. So we had 8 justices left, and we got a tie vote. So it was an equally divided court at 4-4, 4 justices that would have stripped us of civil authority, and 4 votes that would have allowed Choctaw to hear this case. And when you have a tie vote with the court, what that means is that whoever won at the lower level is the winner, at least for that jurisdiction, that circuit. And the Fifth Circuit had ruled in favor of the tribes. So it doesn't set precedent all over the country, but it does mean that within the Fifth Circuit, tribes like Choctaw can hear lawsuits, private lawsuits that involve non-Indians. And so we were really close. We were 1 vote away. 1 vote away. And that's why we have to be vigilant. Every single time another Indian law case goes to the Supreme Court, I want to tell the story of how women will be impacted. And I think that that's something that we all can work on together. So we've got other cases. There's a case pending right now called Carpenter versus Murphy. It used to be called Royal versus Murphy, but one of the parties changed. So it's Carpenter versus Murphy. It's going to be heard by the court this session. It has to do with reservation boundaries. And what's really hard about this work right now for me is my reservation boundaries. 2018, the state of Oklahoma still says that we don't have a reservation, even though we signed a treaty in 1866 that said forever. State of Oklahoma is still fighting with us on that. Now, it's not a case about domestic violence or sexual assault, but it's a case about reservation boundaries. So I helped file a brief last week that said when you restrict tribal authority by diminishing boundaries or whatever methodology you have, who's going to be hurt the most from that is Native women and children who need the protection of their tribal nations because no one else is going to do it. So watch for that case this year. I'm crossing my fingers. It's a sad day for the court for me right now, but we will fight. We will fight, and we will not stop until we're victorious. So those are the main things I wanted to share with you tonight. A lot of people, again, this is just such an amazing opportunity. I just feel so glad that I was able to come back after the tragedy of March, and I do have a lot of people that talk to me about how difficult this work is, and I think I just want to tell you that it's okay. It's okay if you don't want to do this work for a while, if you need to step away from this work, if it's too painful. I just want you, the survivors in the audience, to know that every time you laugh, and every time you smile and tell a joke, and every time you dance, and every time you nail a chemistry final, all of that is a form of victory for you against the perpetrator. Okay? I had a law student come to see me a few years ago. She set up an appointment. She wasn't in any of my classes, so I didn't know what she wanted. She had heard me speak about being a survivor, and she came into me, sat down with me, and she said, I really am glad that you said you're a survivor. She said, because I'm a survivor, and I came to law school because I thought I wanted to spend my life doing this work, and I don't think I can, and I feel guilty about it. And I want to be a tax lawyer because I just took tax and I fell in love with tax law. And I said, you do whatever you want. You don't owe anybody anything. And so for those of you who are struggling right now to figure out where you want to walk in this work, whatever you want to do is what you should do. And I take breaks. In fact, when I was in law school, I stopped doing the hotline for around 6 months because it had become so difficult. The work is still going to be there, you know? So take care of yourself first. You know, nail the chemistry final, right? Become a tax lawyer, but whatever you do is a victory, right? So please, please take care of yourselves, because every day that you are smiling and around and upright and laughing and enjoying those wonderful times as a student that you have, that is a form of victory for you. And I think that surviving well is the best revenge, really. It really is. This is Joy Harjo, who's I'm also a Creek citizen and one of my mentors and heroes, and she's a Guggenheim Fellow, and she's an amazing poet, and she wrote this amazing memoir you should all read called Crazy Brave. She has a poem that's called the Fear Poem, and she also has a musical version of it, but it's a longer poem that's about how to deal with fear. And so I read it a lot. I have it pretty much memorized now. I think you can even find her. Do you remember Deaf Poetry Jam on MTV? You can still find it on YouTube, but she has like an incredible story behind this poem and how it gets rid of fear. And so I just encourage you to find some mantra for yourself, right? Whether it's a song or a wonderful poem like the one we heard earlier tonight, and hold on to that and let it give you strength as you think about this work and try to do this work. But this is, again, you know, the crowd here is a little overwhelming and getting a little verklempt. But thank you for allowing me to come back and reschedule, and especially for allowing me to be here on Indigenous Peoples Day. It's just a really, really good feeling. I got to go to the events this afternoon. It was such beautiful weather, and I'll never forget that moment. So thank you for providing that for me. And thank you for the work that you do, Mado. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Are we gonna try to do questions? I know people are probably busy, but I think we have time for a couple of questions. Is that true? Okay. But I understand that people need to, you know, go to study or whatever. So does anyone have any questions or comments or suggestions would also be cool. And you might have to stand up because it's kind of, I can't see all of you. It's a little dark. Seriously? Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to be honest. I haven't been working on VAWA as much as I've been working on the Supreme Court stuff. The thing about VAWA is that when it originally passed in '94, it was a bipartisan act. It was like 98-0 or something. And if you remember, it's called the Biden-Hatch Act. Imagine, right? And starting in 2012, when we were working on the reauthorization, it became totally partisan. It was totally partisan, and it was about three main problems that one side of the aisle had, and it was about LGBT protections, Native protections, and immigrant protections. And that became a stalemate. And the only way we were able to actually get the Native part to the vote is that a Republican Indian had to break the stalemate. It was Tom Cole, who was Chickasaw from Oklahoma, and he was the one that was able to break the stalemate. So I think that unfortunately now what we're going to see is that VAWA is now, unfortunately, a partisan creature. And so there are going to be fights about things like gun ownership. There's going to continue to be fights about tribal jurisdiction, certainly about Two-Spirit LGBTQ community members, and trying to help immigrant and refugee victims of violence also. Because what we try to do each time VAWA comes up is we try to build on the success and add more pieces to it so that more people are covered by it. But it's the way in which those those categories of people become politicized, that becomes the stalemate. And I haven't heard specifically that the gun issue is one of the holdups right now. That doesn't surprise me at all. I think that I don't have any real fear that VAWA will not be reauthorized, but it's about what will end up in it and what ends up on the cutting room floor. So that's sort of where I'm at with that. But I'm not going to give up. I believe that we can pass another VAWA with more protections for the communities I just mentioned. So thank you. Yes. Question was about non-Indian allies. We need you so desperately. We do not have the numbers in most places to sway an election or to get a piece of legislation in front of a legislative body. So for example, when I talked about these briefs that we're filing on behalf of the Native women's organizations, is that we've had non-Native organizations that have also become our clients. We do this pro bono, you don't have to pay us, but we represent organizations that are concerned about this. And what we found is that non-Native organizations that work with domestic violence and sexual assault, even if they're nowhere near a reservation, think that they understand that this is not just about Native women, this is about correcting longstanding injustices that will ultimately help all victims in this country. So becoming involved in that way, signing on to briefs, talking to lawmakers about Indigenous issues. A lot of us don't have, the money to travel back and forth to Washington or to the state capitol. So if you can also take up the helm and talk about, again, the way we solve rape as a nation must start with Indigenous women. And if you can help us with that message, I think that I will be incredibly grateful for that, because I want to end it, and we need your help. And I believe by ending rape against Native women, we'll be going a long way to ending rape against all women in this country. Yes. Thank you. It's been a rough couple of weeks, as thinking about sexual assault and thinking about the Supreme Court. And I don't want to give any energy to it, but I just want to say that we've faced a lot worse. We really have, and we can do this. We really can. So I think I'll stop there, and again, just thank you very, very much for this opportunity. I think we have a few books in the back, so I'm going to run back there to sign them, and I'm happy to chat with you. If you would like my business card, because you would like my slides, I just didn't happen to bring copies of them, but if you would like my slides, either give me your business card, or if you don't have a business card, give me your email address. And when I get back to my hotel room tonight, I will send you this PowerPoint. Thank you again. This has been a wonderful experience, and I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you.